The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny and warm, like a new midsummer day. Flowers could be seen everywhere, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to come together in the park between the post office and the bank just before 10 o'clock in the morning. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, there were only about 300 people. The whole lottery took less than 2 hours. It was always held at 10 o'clock. That way, it would be finished in time for the villagers to get home for lunch. The children were there first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of freedom had not yet come to most of them. They stood quietly for a while, talking about school, the teacher, and getting in trouble. But the older ones were soon playing noisily. Bobby Martin had already filled his pockets full of stones. The other boys followed his example, looking around for the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the families called the family Delacroix, had made a great pile of stones in one corner of the park. They stood and guarded it against any boys who tried to take them. The girls stood in their own group, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys. The very small children rolled on the ground or held onto the hands of their older brothers and sisters. Soon the men came. They stood away from the pile of stones in the corner, watching their children. They spoke of planting and rain, farm machinery, and the government. Their jokes were quiet, and they smiled at them rather than laughed. The women, wearing house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after the men. They said hello to one another and talked about the latest gossip as they went to stand next to their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call to their children. Many of the children did not want to come, and had to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's hand as she tried to catch him and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was run, as were village dances and other community activities, by Mr. Summers. He owned the coal business, and had the time and energy to help with such things. He was a happy-looking, round-faced man. People were sorry for him because he had no children and a wife who was always complaining about something. When he came into the park carrying the black wooden box, the villagers started talking quietly among themselves. He waved and called out, "Sorry I'm a little late today." Mr. Graves, who was the manager of the village post office, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool. He put the stool down in the center of the park, and Mr. Summers set the black box on it. The villagers stood back from it, leaving a space between themselves and the stool. "Some of you want to give me a hand?" asked Mr. Summers. There was no answer at first. But then 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter, stepped out of the crowd. Mr. Summers asked them to hold the box in place on the stool while he mixed the papers inside it with his hand. The box was very old and no longer completely black. There was a large crack in the wood on one side. In other places the wood was gray with age or badly marked. The original box used for the lottery had been lost long before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in the village, was born. Mr. Summers often spoke to the villagers about making a new box. However, no one liked to go against the tradition of the lottery by changing the box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some of the pieces of the one that had been used before it. The earlier box had been built when the first families came to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about making a new box. But every year the subject was never followed up, and nothing was done. Mr. Martin and his son held the box down until Mr. Summers finished mixing the papers. Much of the original ceremony for the lottery had been forgotten or was no longer followed. This meant that Mr. Summers had been successful in having the pieces of paper used in place of small pieces of wood that were used before. Mr. Summers had argued that pieces of wood were all very well when the village was small. However, it now had more than 300 people and was likely to keep on growing. They needed something that would fit more easily into the black box. That night, the night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the pieces of paper and put them in the box. Then they took the box to Mr. Summers' office and locked it up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the park the next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in a building on Mr. Graves's farm and another on the floor in the post office. Sometimes it was set on a shelf in Martin Grocery and left there. There was a lot to be done before Mr. Summers could start the lottery. First, there were the lists to make up. Lists of heads of families, lists of heads of houses, lists of people living in each house. Next, there had to be a ceremony to give Mr. Summers the power to run the lottery. Mr. Graves was the one to do this, as he had the top government job in the village. Some villagers remembered a time when, long ago, the person who ran the lottery would say some special words to the crowd before it started. After many years, these words came to be spoken so quickly and with so little feeling that they almost sounded like a song. Some people believed that the man used to stand in a certain way when he said or sang them. Others believed that he used to walk among the people. But these things stopped years and years ago. There had also once been some special words that were used in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this had also changed with time. Now all that was needed was for the person running the lottery to say something friendly to each person as they came up to the box. Mr. Summers was very good at all this. In his clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting lightly on the black box, he seemed very correct and important as he talked to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Mr. Summers finally stopped talking and turned to the villagers. As he did, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the park, her sweater thrown over her shoulders. She took a place at the back of the crowd. "I forgot what day it was," she said to Mrs. Delacroix, who was standing next to her. They both laughed softly. "Thought my old man was out back of the house working," Mrs. Hutchinson went on as she dried her hands on her dress. "Then I looked out the window and the children were gone, and I remembered it was the 27th and came as quickly as I could." "You're in time, though," said Mrs. Delacroix. "They're still talking away up there." Mrs. Hutchinson looked through the crowd and saw her husband and children standing near the front. She touched Mrs. Delacroix on the arm to show that she was going and began to make her way through the crowd. The people kindly moved to one side to let her through. Some called out to her husband in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd. "Here comes your wife, Hutchinson," said one. "Bill, she made it after all," called another. Mr. Summers stood with a smile on his face until Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband. "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie," he said. "Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" answered Mrs. Hutchinson. Soft laughter ran through the crowd as people moved back into place. "Well now," Mr. Summers said seriously, "guess we'd better get started and get this over with so we can get back to work. Anybody not here?" "Dunbar," several people said. "Dunbar, Dunbar." Mr. Summers looked at his list. "Clyde Dunbar," he said. "That's right. He's broken his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him?" "Me, I guess," a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. "Wife draws for her husband," Mr. Summers said. "Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie?" The person running the lottery always had to ask such questions, even though he and everyone else knew the answer. Mr. Summers waited with a look of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. "Horace is not but 16 yet," Mrs. Dunbar said. "Guess I've got to fill in for the old man this year." "Right," Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding, then asked, "Watson boy drawing this year?" A tall boy in the crowd put his hand up. "Here," he said. "I'm drawing for my mother and me." He opened and closed his eyes and looked shyly at the ground as some people in the crowd called out to him. "Good man, Jack," said one. "Good to see your mother's got a man to do it," called another. "Well," Mr. Summers said, "guess that's everyone. Old man Warner make it?" "Here," a voice said. Mr. Summers nodded. The crowd suddenly stopped talking as Mr. Summers coughed several times and looked at the list. "All ready?" he called. "Now, I'll read the names, heads of families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear?" The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to what he was saying. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips and not looking round. Then Mr. Summers lifted one hand in the air and said, "Adams!" A man stepped out of the crowd and came up to the box. "Hi, Steve," Mr. Summers said. "Hi, Joe," answered Mr. Adams. They smiled at one another nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded piece of paper. He held it by one corner as he turned and went quickly back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little away from his family, not looking down at his hand. "Allen," Mr. Summers said. "Anderson. Bentham." "Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore," Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves as they stood together in the back of the crowd. "Seems like we only got through with the last one only last week." "Time sure goes fast," Mrs. Graves said. "Clark, Delacroix, "There goes my old man," Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went to the box and drew a piece of paper. "Dunbar?" Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar walked calmly to the box. "There she goes," said a woman in the crowd. "Go on, Janey," called another. "We're next," Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, nodded to Mr. Summers with a serious look on his face, and took a piece of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd there were men holding the small pieces of paper in their large hands, turning them over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding her piece of paper. "Harbert, Hutchinson. Get up there, Bill," Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. "Jones." "They do say," Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, "that over in North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery." "Pack of crazy fools," said Old Man Warner angrily. "Listening to the young people these days. Nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living like in the Stone Age, with nobody working any more. There used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be back to looking for food in the woods rather than growing our own. There's always been a lottery," he added angrily. "Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody." "Some places have already stopped lotteries," Mrs. Adams said. "Nothing but trouble in that," Old Man Warner said forcefully. "Pack of young fools." "Martin!" And Bobby Martin watched his father walk up to the box. "Overdyke! Percy!" "I wish they'd hurry," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. "I wish they'd hurry." "They're almost through," her son said. "You get ready to run tell Dad," Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name, and then stepped up and took a piece of paper from the box, making sure that he did it the right way. Then he called, "Warner?" "77th year I've been in the lottery," Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd. "77th time." "Watson!" The tall boy looked unsure of himself as he came through the crowd. "Don't worry, Jack," someone called. "Take your time, son," said Mr. Summers when he got to the box. "Zanini." After that there was a long pause. Everyone stood still until Mr. Summers, holding his piece of paper in the air, called out, "All right, people." For a moment, no one moved. Then, all the pieces of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once. "Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons?" Then voices began to say, "It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it." "Go tell your father," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quietly, looking down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him enough time to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called. "All our families took part in the draw, just like yours," said Mrs. Graves. "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying up a little more to finish in time." He looked at his next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other family living in other houses?" "There's Dawn and Eva," Mrs. Hutchinson called out loudly. "They should draw with us." "Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said softly. "You know that as well as everyone else." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "I guess not, Joe," Bill Hutchinson said sadly. "Ava draws with her husband's family. That's only fair. And the only other ones in our family are the young ones." "Then in drawing for families, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "And in drawing for houses, that's you too, right?" "Right," Bill Hutchinson said. "How many children, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked. "3," Bill Hutchinson said. "There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave and Tessie and me." "All right, then," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you got all the tickets back?" Mr. Graves nodded and held up the pieces of paper. "Put them back in the box, then," Mr. Summers directed. "Take Bill's and put it in." "I think we should start over," Mrs. Hutchinson said quietly. "I tell you, it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to choose. Everybody saw that." Mr. Graves had taken 5 pieces of paper and put them in the box. Then he dropped all the other papers onto the ground, where they were caught by the wind. "Listen, everybody!" Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. "Ready, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick look around at his wife and children, nodded. "Remember," Mr. Summers said, "take a piece of paper and keep it folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave." Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. "Take a paper out of the box, Davy," Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. "Take just one paper," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you hold it for him." Mr. Graves took the folded paper out of the child's hand and held it, while Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. "Nancy next," Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends looked worried as she went up to the box, holding her skirt close to her body so that it wouldn't blow in the wind. She carefully took out a piece of paper. "Bill Jr.," Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red, almost pushed the box off the stool as he got his paper out. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. She stood still a moment, looking around with a hard face to show she did not agree with what was happening. Then she went up to the box and quickly took a piece of paper and held it out behind her. "Bill," Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out with the last piece of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. "I hope it's not Nancy," said a girl softly, but everyone in the crowd heard her. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said. "Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the piece of paper, and there was a sound of happiness among the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see there was nothing on it. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time. Both smiled and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding their pieces of paper above their heads. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill opened his paper and showed it. There was nothing on it. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said quietly. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced a piece of paper out of her hand. It had a black circle on it. The black circle Mr. Summers had made the night before with the dark pencil in his office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a movement in the crowd. "All right, everyone," Mr. Summers said. "Let's finish this quickly." Although the villagers had forgotten the original ceremony and lost the first black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready, the stones on the ground with the blowing pieces of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix took a stone so large that she had to pick it up with both hands. She turned to Mrs. Dunbar, who had small stones in her hands. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." "I can't run," said Mrs. Dunbar, taking deep breaths. "You'll have to go first, and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few small ones. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now. She held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of her head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was right in front of the crowd of villagers with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair! It isn't right!" Mrs. Hutchinson cried loudly. And then they were upon her.